Over the last 17 years, the weapon systems in Wipeout have undergone a variety of changes to evolve into the form we see them today. Even those that have made an appearance in every single game have changed in one way or another. This video will look back at how the weapons have evolved over the series, and where the influences for other weapons came from. It will also look at older weapons that have since disappeared from the series. Missiles have been a staple of the series from the beginning, acting as an almost guaranteed method of landing a hit on your opponent. However, there have been subtle differences between games. The original game introduced the missile in its simplest form, a single projectile that homes in on a target ahead of you once locked on. It could also be fired blind. The 2097 and 64 missile worked in the same way, but this time by tilting the nose back you could lock onto an opponent behind you. As there was no rear view in the game, rear lock would appear under the weapon indicator if there was an opponent in range. Wipeout 3 introduced multi-missiles. Sacrificing the ability to fire backwards, the craft now fires 2 missiles at a time. Depending on the location of your opponents, it was possible to lock onto more than one craft. Fusion returned to the 2097 model of a single missile that could also be fired backwards. However, locking onto an opponent behind you now required the use of rear view. One thing that was also noticeable is that the missiles locked on as soon as the reticule appeared. There was no need to wait. A vastly stronger version of the missile was introduced as Pfizer's super weapon, the Super Missiles. This consisted of 3 very powerful missiles that could either target a single unlucky opponent or a number of opponents individually. If one opponent suffered hits from all 3 missiles, they were likely to be eliminated. The final variant of the missile introduced in Fusion was the Hunter missile. This was a fire and forget weapon only available in multiplayer that automatically homed in on the leader. Pure and the later games introduced a new mechanic for the missile. While its agility had been reduced and it could no longer be fired backwards, it gained the ability to bounce off walls. This made it quite an unpredictable weapon and difficult to dodge in corners. Rockets are one of the simplest weapons in the series, but in the right hands they can also be one of the most effective. While they lack the guidance system of a missile, they can pack quite a punch. However, in the original game, rockets were awkward to use. Only one was fired at a time, so precise aiming would be required. To all intents and purposes, it was nothing more than a missile without the homing capability. This all changed by the time 2097 came about. To differentiate them from a simple unguided missile, the rockets were now fired 3 at a time in a wide pattern. While it may still be possible for opponents to slip between them, they were much more difficult to avoid and were altogether more effective weapon. The number of rockets was reduced to 2 for Wipeout 3. But with the larger hitboxes of the craft, this wasn't an issue. It remained easy to land a hit on an opponent even at a relatively long range. Fusion's rockets were slightly less useful in terms of attacking a crowd, but can do considerable damage if aimed correctly. Rather than fire in a spread pattern simultaneously, each rocket was fired consecutively straight ahead. Even from a distance, it would be possible to land all 3 rockets on a single opponent, causing a lot of damage. However, the main downside was the trails left behind, which made it very difficult to see ahead. Pure, Pulse and HD returned to the simultaneous firing system, but this time the rockets were fired in a spread pattern. This means it would be possible to hit a crowd at distance, but up close all 3 could hit a single opponent. While the rockets did reasonable damage on impact, they also had a massive slowing effect. "2048 featured 3 different firing methods for rockets depending on the class of craft you were using. Speed class craft could only fire a single rocket, much like the original game. Agility class craft could fire 2 rockets, similar to Wipeout 3. And finally, fighter class craft could fire 3 at once in the same spread pattern as Pure, Pulse and HD. Mines are the classic means of dealing with anyone coming up behind you, and they've changed very little over the course of the series. Their first appearance in the original game was the only way to fire backwards, and so they are the original defensive weapon. Activating it dropped 5 small explosive packages in quick succession behind you. While each individual mine had little effect, running through all 5 caused a significant slowdown. The weapon was left unchanged for 2097, only this time they could cause damage in addition to the slowing effect. Hitting all 5 could significantly damage your craft. In Wipeout 3, the damage was ramped up yet again, but the rate at which they were dropped was reduced. This made it more difficult to make an opponent run through the whole minefield, but it allowed a small amount of unpredictability in the drop pattern. Fusion brought about the only major change to the mines in the whole series. The weapon still dropped 5 mines overall, but this time they had to be deployed individually. Rapidly tapping the fire button would deploy them in the original fashion, but the option was now there to scatter them around the track, significantly increasing their tactical value. They did little damage, but their disrupting effect was significant. Unlike any other mines in the series, they also had a slight homing effect on any craft coming near them. The later games restored the mines to their 2097 function alongside the introduction of the bomb. They've remained that way ever since. "2048 brought about one final change to the mines. Their function was identical to the previous games, but they were now only available to speed and agility class craft. Fighter classes were armed with bombs instead. The turbo is one of the few items in the series designed to be purely defensive, and it has also been a near permanent fixture. Its function throughout the series has always been the same, to provide a speed boost when activated. There are only very slight differences between games. The turbo in the original game was actually quite subtle, providing an instant speed boost that was about twice as powerful as a speed pad. In 2097, the turbo received a significant jolt. It became much more powerful, propelling the craft to immense speeds even in the lower speed classes. However, this made it quite a risky proposition on Phantom class, as it was rather easy to leave the track if used in the wrong place. But this also opened up new possibilities in terms of finding shortcuts, some of which allowed a significant amount of the track to be cut off. The turbo was left out of Wipeout 3 to make way for the hyperthrust system, which allowed the pilot to steadily sacrifice shield energy to receive a significant speed boost. Hyperthrust was removed in Fusion and resulted in the turbo making a return. The main difference this time was to take advantage of the analog nature of the PS2 controller. Pressing the fire button down hard resulted in a short but strong speed boost, whereas lightly pressing it resulted in a longer but slower boost. The turbo gave rise to an unusual weapon in Fusion's multiplayer mode, the Turbo Enforcer. The weapon itself operated like a missile, but on impact with an opponent it triggered a turbo. If this happened as they were entering a corner, it could have some rather amusing results. Pure saw a subtle change in the way that the turbo functioned. Rather than provide an immediate increase in speed, the craft underwent a rapid acceleration instead. This made the craft much easier to control as the speed increased, as there was now a short delay before it reached maximum speed. However, using a turbo over a speed pad resulted in the effect being cancelled in favour of the effect of the pad itself. The turbo retained its function for Pulse, HD and 2048, although speed pads no longer hinder the speed gain from using the item. Like the turbo, the shield has changed little over the course of the series. Its basic function has been to provide a period of invulnerability from the damaging and disrupting effects of weapon impacts and collisions. The only real difference comes in how it interferes with the use of other weapons. As the first game didn't feature weapon damage, the only purpose of the shield was to protect the craft from the slowing effects of weapons. You could pick up additional weapons while it was active, but you couldn't use them until the shield expired. This mechanic changed only slightly in 2097. You were still restricted in the same way regarding weapon use while the shield was active, but you could now drop weapons, providing a small amount more flexibility. This continued into Wipeout 3, and aside from a change of name to the gravity shield, the function was virtually the same as 2097. The only difference this time was that the shield could be manually deactivated by pressing the drop weapon button. Fusion allowed slightly more flexibility. While the shield was active, you were able to pick up and fire other weapons. It could also be manually deactivated. Due to the highly combat-orientated nature of Fusion, the shield also had a slightly longer lifespan than the other games. Pure and onwards allowed total flexibility with the shield. Once active, you were able to pick up, fire and absorb other weapons freely. The shield would only lower once it had expired. The 2048 version of the shield was active for slightly less time. However, if you were holding one and you were hit by a weapon, it would automatically deploy. With the advent of Phantom class in 2097, the Autopilot was brought in to allow a small reprieve to the player, placing control of the craft in the hands of the AI for a short time. The first variant of the Autopilot took control out of your hands for approximately 3 seconds. During that time, you could pick up another weapon, but you'd be unable to use it without deactivating the Autopilot. After the 3 seconds had passed, control would be handed back once the craft had levelled out. Pressing the drop weapon button would manually deactivate it. This type of Autopilot continued into Wipeout 3, functioning in exactly the same way as its predecessor. Fusion continued in a similar manner, but this time it lasted for about 5 or 6 seconds. What was also different was that you could pick up and fire other weapons while it was active. Unfortunately, the gentle letdown of the previous games was gone, and it immediately deactivated at the end of the allocated time. With no indication of how long it had been active for, it was usually best to manually deactivate it rather than wait it out. The autopilot changed again in Pure. It now lasted for 5 seconds, and you were able to pick up, fire and absorb any weapons you wanted while it was active. But this did mean that you were unable to manually deactivate it, leaving you at the mercy of any mines or bombs on the track. It also struggled to handle undulations, and in some cases even caused the craft to flip over. Pulse and onwards saw the autopilot become very restrictive in terms of weapon pickups, but in turn it became much more easily manageable. It still lasted for 5 seconds, but you were unable to pick up any other weapons at all while it was active. However, it could now be manually deactivated again, allowing you to avoid any incoming mines. In some speed classes it was also able to navigate parts of some circuits quicker than it would be possible to on your own, making it popular even among the veterans. In 2048, the autopilot received one final addition. While it was active, a shield would be erected around your craft. Introduced in 2097, the plasma bolt is the most powerful standard weapon in the series. While it's tricky to aim, landing a direct hit can have devastating consequences. It takes about half a second to charge after activating before launching straight ahead, but any opponent it hits is instantly eliminated. Weirdly, the plasma took a slightly different form in Wipeout 64 and appeared as Oricom's super weapon, the Energy Sphere. Unlike the plasma, the Energy Sphere was not an instant elimination and had to be manually charged by holding down the fire button. It could be released at any time, but it would obviously be at its most damaging when fully charged. It would also pass through any opponents, allowing more than one craft to be hit. Wipeout 3 saw the most powerful version of the plasma. As the hitboxes of the craft were bigger than in 2097, it was significantly easier to land a weapon hit. And as the plasma was still a one-hit elimination, it also guaranteed one less opponent whenever you picked one up. Fusion saw the plasma reduced in strength somewhat. Aside from the fact that the bolt itself looked significantly less imposing, the weapon now dealt heavy damage rather than it being an instant elimination. This helped to balance the weapon somewhat, as Fusion was the first game in which the AI also had access to the weapon. The only real change the plasma encountered in the later games was aesthetic, with the bolt exploding on impact. The size of the bolt was slightly increased to make it a bit easier to aim, but its basic function remained the same. It is still the most powerful single target weapon in the series. The Quake has been a fan favourite ever since its introduction in 2097. While it's had a number of tweaks over the course of the series, its basic function has always been the same. In 2097, activating it caused a huge wave to fly down the track ahead, throwing your opponents into the air and slamming them back down on the track. In Wipeout 64, the AI could also use it. It was capable of causing considerable damage, but it had one fatal flaw. The speed of the wave was the same in all speed classes, and in Phantom class it was possible to keep up with it, which blinded you to the track ahead. This problem was dealt with in Wipeout 3. The function of the Quake didn't change, but it now had a variable speed depending on your speed class. It still had just as much power as before, which was very noticeable when it was used in multiplayer. Fusion saw the AI be able to use the Quake again, and with so many opponents on the track it became necessary to tone the power down. The speed of the wave was considerably faster, and it could also break off and travel down splits. And the big change? It could be fired backwards. With the combat element toned down for Wipeout Pure, the Quake underwent a couple of changes. Its stopping power was slightly reduced and it could no longer fire backwards, although by turning your craft around it was still possible. However, the design flaw from 2097 had made its way back into the game again. On Phantom class, the wave travelled too slowly and blinded you from the track ahead. This was fixed in Wipeout Pulse, along with removing the ability to fire the Quake backwards under any circumstances. It remained a firm favourite in Eliminator events to pick off any weak opponents from long range. In 2048, the weapon was restricted. Only agility and fighter class craft could equip it. Bombs first made their appearance in Wipeout Pure and stood alongside mines as the only means of attacking opponents behind you. Only a single bomb would be dropped on activating, but any opponent hitting it would suffer moderate damage and be slowed considerably. The blast radius would also be able to catch anyone in the immediate vicinity. Unlike mines, which self-detonated after a time, bombs remained active until they were hit. This rendered them somewhat unbalanced, and they were given a finite lifespan in Pulse and onwards. Still significantly longer than mines, but if you dropped a bomb, it would be unlikely to be there when you came round for another lap. Otherwise, their function was exactly the same. In 2048, bombs were restricted to fighter class craft only, at the expense of their use of mines. The first concept of a cannon-based weapon came in 2097, where an extremely powerful machine gun was unlockable via use of a cheat code. However, the first legitimate appearance of such a weapon came in Wipeout 64 in the form of Pfizer's super weapon, the minigun. When activated, the craft would rapidly fire a stream of high-velocity projectiles directly ahead for a short time, and it would only take a few hits to eliminate a craft. The first iteration of the cannon as a standard weapon came in Fusion with the Proton Cannon. This was a 25-round weapon that could be fired intermittently until the ammo counter was depleted, and it also made use of the analog nature of the PS2 controller. The harder you held the fire button, the faster the weapon fired. While the rounds didn't necessarily do much damage, they could easily knock a craft off course. The cannon took a short break until Wipeout Pulse, where it returned in a very similar role to its Fusion appearance. The only real differences were an increase in ammo to 30, the loss of the analog firing mechanism, and the fact that the cannon was now a double-barrel weapon. It's remained that way ever since. (2048) introduced another variant on the cannon as an exclusive weapon for the Kyrex prototype. It was armed with a self-reloading version of the weapon that was significantly more powerful, at the expense of being able to pick up any other weapons. There's been a variety of weapons throughout the series designed to disrupt the operation of the craft, eventually culminating in a single weapon that encapsulated all of them. The first game contained 3 of them. The Shockwave operated in a similar fashion to the missile, but rather than dealing damage, the craft would slow down and become somewhat more difficult to control. While this would be manageable on open circuits, it could cause significant problems on technical circuits. The weapon re-emerged in 2097 as the Electro Bolt. Despite a different graphic and name, it was essentially the same weapon. Finally, another variant of this weapon emerged in Fusion in the form of G-Tech's super weapon, the Biosnare. Upon firing, a single unguided rocket was launched straight forward and a large virus cloud was left on impact. Any craft flying through this would suffer disruption to their controls for a short time. Two other disruptive weapons also existed in the original game. The ECM pod would disable your opponent's ability to pick up weapons for a short time, while the RevCon would reverse your opponent's steering. However, these weapons were only available in multiplayer via link cable, and as such I was not able to record footage for them. The idea of reversing controls came up again in Wipeout Fusion in the form of the Control Jammer. Another multiplayer only weapon, it was fired in the same manner as a missile. Anyone hit by it would have their steering reversed. The ultimate culmination of all of these weapons was the emergence of the Disruption Bolt in Wipeout Pure. This was a single unguided weapon that randomly inflicted one of a variety of effects on the target. The control disruption and reverse controls of the weapons that influenced it were there, but there were a number of new effects brought in, such as causing the craft to bounce, making the camera behave erratically, disabling air brakes, and so on and so forth. But to counter this, there was also the risk of triggering an autopilot in the target, inadvertently helping them rather than hindering them. The first appearance of a wall-type weapon was in Wipeout 64 in the shape of Kyrex's super weapon, the Power Snare. When activated, a projectile was sent hurtling up the track ahead, eventually forming a wall that covered one side of the track. Any craft passing through it except yours would suffer heavy damage. This was adapted for use in Wipeout 3 as a normal weapon, which became the Force Wall. The basic mechanics of the weapon were the same as the Power Snare, but rather than dealing damage to opponents, they simply bounced back when they hit it. It was less of a damaging weapon and more of a heavy disruption. Leech weapons were designed to drain shield energy from your opponents and transfer it to your own craft. They began life in Wipeout 64 in the shape of AG Systems' super weapon, the Shield Raider. It was far more powerful than any of its future incarnations. Once locked on, it would immediately drain all the shield energy from the target and use it to restore a small amount of your own reserves. Of course, this meant that any further damage to the target would destroy it, making the Shield Raider an incredibly powerful weapon. The regular version introduced in Wipeout 3 was much more sedate. The energy drain also needed to lock onto a craft, but this time it would slowly drain the target's energy and then add it to your own. Also, the link had to be maintained for the effect to last. If the target moved too far away, it would be broken. The effect would also end if your shield energy was full. The weapon returned to its role as a super weapon in Fusion for Zyos in the form of the shield drain. Like the previous incarnations, it locked onto an opponent in the same way as a missile, before draining the shield energy of the target. The main difference this time was that the link would stay active even if your shield energy was full, and the regeneration rate of your energy was significantly greater. This version of the weapon was the main inspiration behind its final iteration, the Leech Beam. Introduced in Wipeout Pulse, it follows almost the same mechanics as the shield drain. The rate of energy gain and loss was somewhat lower than before, but it was now a normal weapon again. It also had a small disruptive effect. The final addition to the Leech beam came in 2048, where a shield was erected around your craft while the link was active. The last weapon to be introduced from Wipeout 64 was the Stealth, which was the super weapon of Piranha. On activation, your craft became completely immaterial for a short time. It was able to move through other craft, and weapons would also pass harmlessly through you. Homing weapons would also be unable to gain a lock. The only appearance of this weapon as a general item came in Wipeout 3 in the form of the Cloak. Its function was significantly lessened from Wipeout 64 to accommodate its role as a standard weapon. This time the craft would become invisible to opponents, meaning that homing weapons could not lock on. But any hits from unguided weapons would still cause damage, and the craft could no longer move through the others. The last appearance of the weapon would be as a multiplayer item in Fusion in the form of the Stealth, and it worked in the same way as the Wipeout 3 version. Aside from the weapons that have been a regular sight over the course of the series, or those that have influenced new ones, there have also been a number of weapons that were unique in their own right, but for whatever reason were not included in any other games. This section covers the one-hit wonders of the Wipeout universe. The Thunder Bomb appeared in 2097 and 64 only. A single bomb was released from the back of the craft, and a second later, a massive explosion would damage and slow all opponents within view. Despite it being labelled as a bomb, it was not a defensive weapon, as it would have no effect on opponents behind you. The E-Pack is another weapon exclusive to 2097 and 64. It could only be picked up when your shield energy was critical, and activating it would instantly restore 20% of your shield energy, hopefully keeping you going long enough to reach the pit lane. The Reflector made its sole appearance in Wipeout 3. Rather than act as a barrier to soak up damage, the Reflector was designed to reflect projectiles back at the firer. If used in multiplayer, it would also reverse the effects of the energy drain weapon. However, it was useless against non-projectile weapons such as the Quake and mines. The Grav Stinger was a type of defensive weapon seen in Fusion. Dropping it left a small glowing area on the track, and any craft flying over it would be dragged down to the ground and immobilised for a short time. If dealing damage to your opponents wasn't proving effective, catching your opponent in one of these most certainly would be. The Gravity Bomb was a projectile version of the Grav Stinger and could affect a much wider area. The bomb was released in an arc in front of the craft, and anybody in the blast radius when it landed would be dragged to a halt as if they'd been hit with a Grav Stinger. The weapon was very unpopular as it frequently slowed the pace of the game. The grenades were another weapon that only appeared in Fusion, and they would serve as an inspiration for the pattern followed by rockets in the later games. The weapons would launch 3 grenades down the track in a spread pattern, but unlike the rockets they would bounce along the track. This meant that any undulations could cause the grenades to bounce over your target or off the track entirely. Up close, however, they were a very effective weapon. The flamethrower appeared in Fusion only, and like the cannon was an ammunition based weapon. Holding the fire button released a stream of flame in front of your craft, dealing steady damage to anybody in the way. The intensity of the flame was also affected by how hard the fire button was pressed, but it was ultimately a very weak weapon with no disruptive effect, and it was not used in any future games. The Seismic Field was the super weapon of Van Uber in Fusion. It was not designed to cause damage directly, but could potentially cause some serious disruption. The weapon launched a dark energy sphere down the track directly ahead, and any opponents in the near vicinity were violently pulled towards it. This could lead to a heavy wall impact or could significantly disrupt opponents' racing lines, and it also had the added effect of darkening the sky every time one was launched. The super weapon of Oricom in Fusion was a target painter for their orbital weapons platform. It was fired in the same way as a missile, but once locked on, a huge laser was fired on the unfortunate target, causing considerable damage, spinning them and cloaking them in a cloud of smoke. This was a weapon which was very difficult to make a recovery from due to the disorientation. However, as expected from an orbital platform, the weapon would fail if it was used undercover. The Power Swarm was EGR's super weapon in Fusion. Rather than dealing damage all at once, it dealt constant damage over time. Firing the weapon released a set of drones that swarmed all over the target, bombarding it with laser fire which steadily drained their shield energy. The only way the victim could lose the drones without waiting for the effect to end was to activate a shield. Tigron's super weapon in Fusion was the Nitro Rocket. It was a guided weapon similar to a missile that did moderate damage, but it crystallised the hull of the target for about 6 seconds. During this period, any damage suffered was massively amplified, to the point that even a solid ram from another craft would completely destroy it. The Penetrator was one of the more unique weapons in the Fusion arsenal, and was Piranha's super weapon. The Penetrator effectively turned the craft itself into a weapon. Once locked on, the nose of the craft would charge up and a fast autopilot would activate. Eventually, the craft would ram the target, dealing significant damage and slowing them dramatically. While it seemed like an innovative feature, the autopilot could be temperamental at times, making it rather unreliable. As it was a collision-based weapon, it also caused a small amount of damage to your own craft. The Global Drain was the last of Fusion's multiplayer exclusive weapons. It was essentially a weapon that screwed over everybody. Activating it caused the energy generators of every craft on the circuit to short out, rendering them critical. This included your craft as well. If you were near a pit lane, this could turn the race in your favour, and following it up with a Quake could result in a lot of eliminations. The Shuriken was an Eliminator exclusive weapon in Pulse. It was an unguided weapon that was able to ricochet off the track walls, passing through every opponent it met and dealing damage to them. While it was able to deal damage to several opponents in one shot, the level of damage dealt was fairly minimal. Its erratic path also made it fairly unreliable in some respects. The Repulsor was the second Eliminator exclusive weapon in Wipeout Pulse, and it was the most sought after in that mode due to it being almost guaranteed to rack up some eliminations. When activated, the weapon sent out a wave of energy in all directions. It had a considerable range rivalled only by the Quake, and dealt huge damage to everything in its path. Despite uploading this video at the start of 2013, I actually started work on it back when Studio Liverpool was still active. Like anyone who's been a fan of the series to any extent, I was absolutely devastated to hear of the news that they were being closed. Not just because of the potential loss of the Wipeout series overall, but because a lot of really good people ended up losing their jobs that day. So I say not just from myself, but on behalf of Wipeout Zone, and I hope my feelings will be shared by the whole Wipeout community, that I'd like to wish all the best to everybody who worked at Studio Liverpool in their future endeavours. If you would like to continue to support those that were involved in the series, several of them have moved on to other studios and indeed gone on to set up their own. For example, Sawfly Studios, Phasic Labs, Playrise Digital and Lucid Games. And I would like to issue a personal thanks to Amy Nakajima for all of her support over the last year, both in terms of helping to publicise events on Wipeout Zone, as well as helping me with some of the stuff on the channel. So where does this leave me? Well, I'm certainly not going to give up supporting the game. I'm going to continue running events on Wipeout Zone, and where I can, hopefully, I'm going to continue putting videos out on the channel. After all, I certainly have a lot of unfinished business with 2048, and now I've got a camera that's decent enough to record some of the stuff, I might actually start working on that. As always, thank you very much for watching my videos, it really is appreciated. Please do continue your support if you can.